You know, when we think about scientific breakthroughs, we picture labs, data, maybe a eureka moment. But what about the stuff we don't see? Behind every discovery, there's this invisible framework of rules making sure our search for answers doesn't come at the cost of our own humanity. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on these crucial, unseen rules of research. So, where did all these rules come from? You might think they were just hammered out in some committee meeting, right? Well, no. The reality is much darker. They were forged in the fire of some of history's absolute worst moments, born from times when that noble pursuit of science went terribly, terribly wrong.
Okay, just read that. Let it sit for a second. A human life is nothing compared to a new fact in science. Wow. And this wasn't some crackpot idea from the fringes. This was a prominent chemist back in 1895. That kind of thinking, that belief that people were just tools for gathering data, that's exactly why the world had to hit the brakes and say, never again.
And the world did respond. It had to. After the absolute atrocities of World War II, we got the Nuremberg Code. This was the first real line in the sand. Then in '64, the Declaration of Helsinki built on that. And then, a huge one, especially in the US, was the Belmont Report in 1979. Each one of these was a major step forward, building a global agreement that, look, people come first, period. So, okay, we've seen the problem, right? The really dark history. So, how do we get from that to the system we have today? Well, the answer is surprisingly elegant. It really boils down to three foundational ideas that guide pretty much all ethical research now. And here they are, the big three, the pillars of it all, coming right out of that Belmont Report. We've got respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Now, this isn't just some checklist you tick off. Think of them as a three-legged stool. They all work together. They're the absolute bedrock of this whole thing. So let's dig into what each one actually means. All right, first up, respect for persons. At its core, this is all about autonomy. It means recognizing that every person in a study is in the driver's seat of their own life. They get to make the call freely without anyone pushing them one way or another. It's their body, their choice, full stop. Okay, pillar number 2 is beneficence. This is kind of like the doctor's oath, first do no harm. But it's more than that. It's a two-sided coin. On one side, you have to try and maximize all the good that could come from the research. On the other, you have to do everything you can to minimize the risks. It's a constant balancing act. But one thing is non-negotiable. The person's welfare always comes first. And that brings us to our third pillar, justice. This one is all about fairness. It poses a really simple but profound question. Who is being asked to take on the risks of this research, and who's going to get to enjoy the benefits? Justice says you can't have one group of people, say a poor or vulnerable community, taking all the risks while another, more privileged group gets all the rewards. The burdens and the benefits, they have to be shared fairly. Okay, so those three pillars are the big ideas, right? The what and the why. But that's all a bit abstract. So how does this actually work in the real world? What are the nuts and bolts, the actual tools researchers use to make this happen? The number one tool in the toolbox is something called informed consent, and this is respect for persons made real. Now, we've all probably signed a consent form at the doctor's office, but this is so much more than just a piece of paper. It's a whole conversation, a process where the researcher has to lay everything out on the table, what the study's for, what the risks are, any potential benefits, everything. Only then can someone make a real, truly informed choice. And get this. The bar for consent in research is often way higher than it is for just regular medical treatment. Think about it. For a surgery, a parent can just say yes for their 10-year-old. But in a research study? The parent's consent is not enough. The kid also has to agree. They have to give what's called assent. It's this extra layer that shows we respect that even a child has a voice in that decision. Of course, protecting people isn't just about their bodies. It's about their private information, too. And researchers have a whole checklist of things they have to do. They swap out names for anonymous codes. They lock down records, both digital and paper. They make sure only the essential team members can even see the data. And when they publish the results, it's always grouped together, so you could never, ever point to one specific person. So you're probably wondering, who's the referee here? Who makes sure everyone is playing by these rules? Well, they're called Research Ethics Committees, or you'll hear this term a lot in the US, IRBs, for Institutional Review Boards. Think of them as the ultimate gatekeepers.
A researcher can't even start a study with people until they get a green light from one of these committees. They are the check and balance for the whole system.
Okay, so it all sounds pretty straightforward so far, right? Principles, rules, committees. But the real world is messy. It's not always black and white. Sometimes these amazing principles actually bump up against each other, creating these really tough ethical gray areas.
Let's take a real-world example. The Ebola outbreak a few years back. You've got a terrifying disease, people are dying every day, and the only sliver of hope is a brand new experimental vaccine. Suddenly, that whole risk versus benefit calculation we talked about, it gets completely turned on its head. I mean, how do you do a slow, careful study when the clock is ticking and people's lives are on the line?
Here's another tricky one: culture. That idea of respect for persons is very focused on the individual making a choice. But what about cultures where big decisions are made as a family, or where a community elder's approval is essential? You can't just walk in with a standard Western consent form and expect it to work. It might not just be ineffective, it could be seen as deeply disrespectful.
And this really brings it home. This quote is from a woman in a study about spousal violence. Her story is so unique, so specific. Now put yourself in the researcher's shoes. In a small community where everyone knows everyone, how on earth do you promise her confidentiality? How do you protect her from harm if someone figures out she participated? This is where it stops being a textbook problem and becomes a real, high-stakes tightrope walk.
So here's the big takeaway. These ethical rules, they aren't just some dusty old book on a shelf meant to keep us from repeating the mistakes of the past. That's part of it for sure, but it's so much more. It's a living, breathing framework that helps researchers navigate that constant tension, the push for new knowledge versus the absolute non-negotiable need to protect human dignity. And really, that leaves all of us with a huge question to think about. It's not just for scientists. In this nonstop race for answers, for progress, where do we draw the line? How do we balance that incredible hunger for knowledge with our most basic duty to protect each other?